So the title of my presentation is Working with Others in Integrated Resource Management, an Evolving Approach. And you've all been part of this evolution for quite a while. So you know it's sort of ever-moving, ever-changing, and we're all kind of challenged to keep up with how things are moving forward. So with respect to integrated resource management, just sort of starting with the context, it is the system and the means by which Alberta will achieve responsible resource stewardship. That is sort of how the system is being defined, and the management of our resources in an integrated manner. It's really broadly defined. We're still using those concepts of cumulative effects management that you're all very familiar with. The grounding in knowledge, the focusing on outcomes, some of those key pieces. And really these principles are those related to adaptive watershed management planning. So this is key work that you're involved in, and that adaptive management system is something that you're all very familiar with. So the system itself, the Integrated Resource Management System, is comprised of a number of functions, ranging from strategic intent through to evaluating and reporting how the system is performing. So just, again, these probably look familiar to you in terms of cumulative effects management, but they're now being more broadly defined with respect to a bigger system. So strategic intent there at the top of the diagram really is about setting the direction to achieve the outcomes of the system and to enable the functionality of the system. And it's expected that these functions sort of flow from one to the next. So the next function within the system is about setting outcomes in policies and plans. And that's really for environmental and resource development. Certainly work you do with recommendations you make in watershed management plans and input into policy development like the water conversation and so forth are certainly examples of working to set outcomes in policies and plans. The policy assurance piece at the bottom of the diagram, that really is a suite of regulatory and non-regulatory tools that are used based on environmental conditions that may be present, the level of risk with the associated activity that's taking place, and the progress that one wants to make towards achieving those outcomes. Performance, evaluation, and reporting, that's sort of comprised of two pieces. The first one is around measuring and evaluating the system, the elements of the system, and the effectiveness. And the reporting piece, which is something, again, WPACs are familiar with your state of watershed reporting function, is really about making information and data accessible. And it also includes key pieces like traditional ecological knowledge with respect to the emerging work with the Alberta Environmental Monitoring, Evaluation and Reporting Agency, EMIRA. This is a key area where that agency will be undertaking a lot of work. And then not to be remiss in mentioning the sort of continuous improvement and adaptation that is undertaken. Well, once we have evaluated conditions, we have evaluated the system, we have reported out on it, what changes are we going to make? And then how does that reflect back into strategic intent to say, okay, do we need to tweak that direction a little bit? Do we need to look at perhaps setting some new outcomes? And how can that system sort of flow and be implemented? And then, of course, knowledge and informatics is foundational to all of that. There's all kinds of knowledge out there that is important to be an input into the system. And then that informatics piece is really sort of some of the nuts and bolts of how do you take that data and information and share that in a way that is open and accessible to all. So the system is comprised of a bunch of functions, like I just stated. The system also is comprised right now of a number of government entities. The top right of the screen, we have Alberta Energy. We have the Aboriginal Consultation Office in green there, which provides leadership, advice, and expertise in First Nations consultation. We have AMIRA at the bottom there, the now stood up agency responsible for monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. We have the Alberta Energy Regulator, responsible for administering our regulatory framework for upstream oil, gas, and coal. And then on the top left there, one that's pretty near and dear to my heart, Environment and Sustainable Resource Development. So this is around stewarding our air, land, water, biodiversity, and working with Albertans to do so. So the system is comprised of some functions, it's comprised of some entities right now, and those will continue to emerge, I'm sure, over time, and it's also comprised of some key outcomes. So some of you may have seen, we have an IRMS fact sheet that speaks to what a sort of fully functioning IRMS system sometime in the future will look like, and these are some key outcomes of the system. And I just wanted to certainly flag the one in red font there, the strong relationships with partners and stakeholders, because while we're not there in all places at all times, that is something that my team is really focused on, and some of the work that I'm going to speak to in a little more detail later is related to. So working with others in IRMS, an integrated resource management system, you know, we are calling our work to deliberately advance that particular outcome of strong relationships with partners and stakeholders, working with others in IRMS. It just flows off the tongue a little easier. You know, we are working with a lot of external people and organizations in the system, and you know, those involve other sectors such as academia, non-government organizations, industry, and the public. We've got partners such as WPACs and airshed zones and the Alberta Water Council. And then we also have additional stakeholders and communities, including other orders of government. So all of this work is guided by a sort of a purpose and principles document that was created through working with our integrated resource management system, deputy ministers and CEOs. So we have a steering committee comprised of those people, and it also includes executive council and our policy management office. And we worked with them to develop a series of statements around why we work with others in integrated resource management, so that's the purposes piece, and the principles, which is how we will work with others in integrated resource management. And that really guides a number of pieces that are currently underway. We have an engagement framework that the Policy Management Office is working on, and that Policy Management Office actually reports to Alberta Energy and Alberta Environment and Sustainable Resource Development. But they're working at that sort of engagement on policy related to natural resource management and what is a broad framework that could capture all of our work in that regard. The second piece is a project that was undertaken and led through my shop, and that's the Multi-Stakeholder Organization Review. And we had participation from WPACs in that work. We also had, where's Hugh Sanders? I know he's here somewhere. We had a series of workshops where we invited some external advisors to come in and give us some advice around this work. And so thank you, Hugh, and everyone else who helped contribute to this work. We have the roundtable conversations that are happening right now with different stakeholder groups with Minister Fawcett, and I'm happy to say that's where he was rushing off to, was a session that was organized with our agriculture stakeholders. And that's another series of conversations that our team has worked to organize. We have a strategic plan for relationships for the department that we worked with all different divisions of ESRD to create. So what is that strategic approach to those relationships that we have? And an example of sort of a spin-off from that, an example of that would be our municipal relationship strategy, where we're sort of really developing a clear path for GOA and ESRD in these sort of municipal types of relationships. And the hope is that we will work on different relationship groupings over time and create those kinds of strategies for each type of relationship that we have. So I mentioned the purposes earlier, this sort of why we work with others in integrated resource management. And you know, these are sort of the 6 elements that were agreed upon at that high level. You know, there's words like innovation and leveraged action, and in brackets there I've just sort of put my interpretation of those things. So clearly we don't have all of the thinking that we need to undertake this work. And I'm actually pretty good at math. If some people are chuckling at the 1 and 1 plus 3, that was deliberate. So I'm not so bad at math. But it, you know, we talk about the expectation for openness and being able to have access to information and data. We talk about ownership for solutions built together, and certainly adding to the durability of any of the decisions that we make, any of the recommendations that we make, any of the courses of action that we take together. Certainly building those together helps those over time be implementable in a realistic way. Leveraged action and resources, and really the multiplier effect is very evident, certainly with the work with WPACs and many of our other partners. Living up to commitments, we certainly have a series of commitments that we've made with other governments. We have legislation. There's constitutional implications for things like engagement and consultation with First Nations. So we have commitments that we also need to keep. So that's another reason why we work with others in integrated resource management. And of course, that responsible global citizenship piece. You know, we need to be doing our part, and working with others in the system helps us to collectively achieve our part and our role on the global front. So these are the principles of how we will work with others in integrated resource management. And you know, some of these principles you've seen before. They might appear a little bit motherhood-like, but they're good to repeat. But some of the ones that are a little bit different are those sort of top 3 there, where we talk about taking a more deliberate approach, where we're going to be more efficient and effective in the types of approaches that we take. And we will ensure inclusive participation, but at appropriate levels. So this is getting a little bit away from all things, all the time, everywhere, to everybody. We've heard loud and clear from stakeholders and communities that that's really not possible, as well as within government. There's only we have our limitations as well, as you know. And so this is really about being more deliberate in how we do that work. So I said I would go into a little bit more detail about a project that we've recently made quite a bit of progress on. I would offer that this work is continuing. We talked about evolution at the beginning, so this is an ongoing process. But what we had support to do from the IRMS deputies and CEOs was looking specifically, we talked about this sort of different types of relationship groupings that we have, and we wanted to look more closely at multi-stakeholder organizations within the system. So this work was really about, you know, starting to describe what that could look like. Certainly multi-stakeholder organizations provide a great starting point in that you are linked to many different sectors. You operate in very different regions of the province, undertake work in different topic areas, different environmental media, and also in different functions of the system. So some are working on setting policy and plans, some are working on policy assurance, and so forth. The commitment here as well from government was to be as effective, efficient, and relevant as possible in all of the work that we do. So we had some key drivers for this work. Certainly some of it was the outcomes of the system that I stated earlier. And one of those is certainly the strong relationships with partners and stakeholders. We had this little exercise that we undertook recently in government called results-based budgeting. And that is really about government being more effective with our resources, our time, our programs. And there was also a review initiated of the Cumulative Environmental Management Association earlier this year, and they were under some strict timelines because of their fiscal year timing. So that was another driver in terms of the sort of speed at which we were doing some of this work. So we did a number of we took a number of steps, and the first one was looking at approaches for multi-stakeholder participation in sort of resource management-based jurisdictions around the world. It was quite limited in terms of our time, but maybe the most interesting thing around that was we were looking at when a system was set up, how purposeful was that jurisdiction, and also setting up multi-stakeholder organizations that could support that system. And really the closest fit was Water for Life. Surprise! I know you're probably not surprised to hear that. Because, you know, at the onset of Water for Life, when it was released, one of the key directions was partnerships. And it was very clear what those kinds of partnerships would be and the types of work that those partnerships would undertake. So I think kudos on all of us for that, because I think it's been, while it always hasn't been maybe a smooth road, it's been pretty clear in terms of the contributions of multi-stakeholder organizations to Water for Life, without a doubt. We also looked at the current state of different types of multi-stakeholder organizations in Alberta's system. We created a few what we heard documents because we had some internal and external workshops relative to this work. We developed a series of characteristics and criteria of excellence, both from a multi-stakeholder organization perspective and for the system. And we created a final report and recommendations on this work, which we then presented to the IRMS Steering Committee for their approval and for release. So we found some pretty interesting things in this work, and we certainly, when we focused on what is the current state, what are multi-stakeholder organizations, I'll just call them MSOs from now on, what are MSOs doing to contribute to the system? You know, they're providing a lot of value. Again, not a surprise. But in providing that value, they do operate quite independently. So there's different sort of spotlights on the landscape, and there's different aspects to that, I guess, around organizations assuming differing roles, quite often operating within silos. It's great to see the WPAC community actually comes together a couple of times a year. So you are involved in sharing with each other, which is great. So, but we haven't found all organizations operating that way. In terms of the flow through the functions, sometimes there's not as much flow as we'd like to see in terms of strategic intent, setting outcomes, policy assurance, etc. And with different functions, there's not always a lot of consistency in terms of how different topics, media, or resources sort of are shared amongst each other. The air groups kind of don't always talk to the water groups, and the biodiversity groups might not talk to the land groups, etc. So another observation was sort of that timing of the work in alignment with GOA, and I know Robert Stokes is going to talk tomorrow around alignment of WPAC plans with GOA sort of objectives as well. So just sort of seeding that a little bit for tomorrow. I think it's tomorrow, Robert? Yes. And GOA is not always in very good alignment with our multi-stakeholder organizations either. And we need to do a better job of being clear of what we need and when in our relationships. So with those workshops, we sort of merged different people's ideas. We sort of had to come up with a model for multi-stakeholder participation in the system. And this sort of from left to right represents, you know, provincial, regional, local scales, what some of the different roles could be of multi-stakeholder organizations with respect to the system and what the system requires. And then looking at how do we build coordination amongst social, environmental, and economic, amongst the different secretariats, and looking at different media and different issues. So some of the key recommendations that came out of this work, at the provincial scale, looking at an approach that could transition into informing provincial strategic intent for the different functions across the media, the different sectors, and the issues. So some of the activities were around leveraging non-permanent approaches a little bit better, because we have conferences, we have conversations. How do we leverage that a little bit more? And then looking at opportunities to improve efficiency and effectiveness, such as perhaps common secretariats amongst existing provincial forums at that scale. With respect to the regional scale, this really is grounded in sort of the land use framework and the legislation that is there in ALSA to support it. So this talks about you know, establishing or ensuring that we have at least one multi-stakeholder forum in each land use framework region as needed that reflects the context of that region. And then locally, again, over time, we didn't focus locally very much in this work, but it was recognized that it's an important scale to consider, certainly with work related to such a fine scale, say as lakes. This can become very important for issues. There were a number of requirements for success for this work, including communicating better, clarifying government's expectations. I know WPACs have heard that before and have voiced that before. Adapting our internal government processes that better align with the intent. So looking at, are we contractors or are we partners? And what tools would reflect that more appropriately? Certainly it needs to be resourced appropriately. And there needs to be that provincial strategic intent for integrated resource management to sort of drive the whole system. And how can that be developed in order to do that? So what's next in this work? Well, certainly more work to come. The IRMS ministries and agencies continue to explore our relationships with multi-stakeholder organizations. So, we will be continuing to engage on enhancing the broader system. Certainly we need to build on the strengths because, as we have learned, there are many. Change is already happening. Organizations have had contacts change. Thank you for that very sad face, Mark. I will wrap up. We're going to learn something from the Lower Athabasca work and looking at SEMA, as well as explore opportunities to improve efficiency and effectiveness at that provincial scale. And I know Bill Weary, our Deputy Minister, has already started to have conversations with both the Alberta Water Council and then the Clean Air Strategic Alliance is undergoing its regular 3-year review right now, and this work will be important context for that. So I guess my final message is, through all of this, is that the multi-stakeholder model is a very valuable one. The system needs input of multi-stakeholder organizations, and we're hoping that it will be a successful strategy for engagement going forward. And with respect to WPAC specifically, obviously continue to perform your valuable functions that you are providing to the system because you're part of the success.